This conference will now be recorded.
There we go. Great. Thank you. Well, welcome everyone to our weekly clean call. This is Kristen Poppleton. I am your host today. And I just want to open it up first to the group if anyone has any announcements, any things they'd like to share before we go into our presenter for the day.
Okay, I will. Jim Callahan. Coming up, the annual International Public Science Events Conference. It'll be in San Diego, June 2nd through the 5th. And part of the thing would be a question I'll follow up by email of, are there other parts of the Clean Network who would like to be represented or have a part of that? Essentially, science festivals, science events have now become a significant percentage of how science education takes place in the United States, with events with tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people coming to them. And as far as I know, the Mobile Climate Science Lab is the only organization in the network who engages that, who ensures that climate science and climate solutions and tying into humanities and everything is at these gigantic events, and just want to see if others are interested in connecting through this summit. So it's the International Public Science Events Conference. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. And is anyone on the network a part of that besides Jim? Sounds like no one's.
Yeah. Right, and I guess in some ways, the way we identify that is it's in more the genre of informal science and reaching the public on a broad scale. That's, I think, like at AGU, that's the category we tend to put it into, in contrast to, say, inside the K-12 schools. So.
Great. Does anyone else have any announcements?
Yeah, that sounds great, Jim, by the way. This is Lynn Sherry.
Hi, Lynn.
We're having 2 civic engagement and democracy educator workshops in the Pittsburgh area, one on June 1st at Fern Hollow Nature Center and one on June 22nd at the Pittsburgh Botanical Garden. So if you know anybody in Pittsburgh, please let them know. Thanks.
And Lynn, definitely we want to put you in touch with the people from CUSP, Marianne Steiner, for instance, they're in Pittsburgh. So you'd want to connect with them.
All right, we'll follow up with you. Thanks.
Oh. All right. Great. Well, I'll put a plug in for folks to share, or if you're interested, our Summer Institute for Climate Change Education is coming up in August. We're open for registration. It's taking place in Washington, D.C. at the Lowell School. And the focus is on humanities. We have 2 keynotes figured out at this point. John Cook from Skeptical Science will be speaking one day, and one of the authors of one of the research scientists from Drawdown, a young woman, and her name is escaping me actually, but I'll put the information up in the chat box just on a link to that. But we're excited to be going to DC and supporting teachers around the country there this year. So if you're interested, feel free to ask me more questions, or I will put info in the chat box.
Great.
Yeah, that sounds great. Yeah.
And Kristen, also, the offer is open also of educational institutions, schools in the D.C. and Maryland and Delaware area, connecting with those. Because we do a good deal in Washington, D.C., and it's sometimes hard to find each other's organizations. So.
Yeah, feel free to pass along information, Jen. That would be great.
Okay.
We have a website and the registration. I think I usually forward our blasts to the network when they go out, so I will throw it in there.
Great.
Cool.
Great.
All right.
I wanted to ask, is anyone on the call involved in the Drawdown conference in New York?
We were last year. I'm not sure that we'll be participating this year. This is Kristen. I know Jen Krutzer is working on it. But
This is Alexandra from Mass Audubon, and I will be attending. I'm not sure to what extent, what other role we would be playing with the organization, but I will be attending in New York.
Cool. Great. Well, I'm going to segue into introducing our speaker for the day, Lisa Gardiner. She will be speaking Climate is Elementary, Climate Postcards. And Lisa leads the educational resource development at the UCAR Center for Science Education, developing K-12 curriculum and exhibit and website content to help people of all ages learn about the science of our planet. She is also the author of Tales from an Uncertain World, What Other Assorted Disasters Can Teach Us About Climate Change, and co-creator of Elementary Globe. So Lisa, we're really happy to have you here today. I don't know if you want to try sharing your screen again.
Oh, right. Okay, let's try this.
Great. Awesome.
All right, you guys can see it. Well, let's try the presentation mode. All right, this will be our first interactive portion. Can you all see presentation mode, or does it look just like a normal PowerPoint screen?
It looks white and blank right now.
Oh, we don't like that. Okay, let's look at it the other way. Okay, escape.
And it just went back to the sort of main screen. I wonder if it was an issue with your sharing of the screen, Lisa. I don't know if you want to try that again.
Oh, it did, didn't it? Okay, hold on a second. All right, here we go. We all get to look at it not in presentation mode, which will just be more fun for all of us, I think. Thanks for bearing with me. So I'm at an organization, a nonprofit organization in Colorado. As Kristen said, the UCAR Center for Science Education, and we are an education group associated with the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And I don't usually have time to be on these calls, so I'm really excited to be here. Of course, I made time because I'm presenting, so I suppose I need to get onto these calls more regularly. But what we do here is a lot of climate and weather education. We have a group that that teaches people in our local area about weather and climate. And then my group is more about developing and distributing educational resources for formal and informal education around the country and the world via the web. So I'm going to tell you about one of those resources today, which is an elementary activity called Climate Postcards. Oh, and just anecdotally, Alexandra, I hear you're from Mass Audubon, and my first job in science education was as an intern at Mass Audubon, so at Drumlin Farm. So I'm happy that, you know, that was in 1991, I think. So yay, I love Mass Audubon.
That's awesome to hear. Thanks.
I still have such fond memories of the place. So Climate Postcards, though, this activity, the URL is at the bottom of this slide, and if you'd like to follow along, you're welcome to. You know, look up the activity right now, but I'll also repeat this URL at the end if you want to head to it then. And this activity I developed several years ago, soon after the Next Generation Science Standards came out. And there is a performance expectation in there for third grade about obtaining and combining information to describe climate regions around the world. And so it was exciting to see that. And I wanted to develop something for third grade that addressed climate regions in kind of an age-appropriate way. And didn't bog down in the details that we hope that middle and high school students can get their heads around. But this activity, it has two parts, and each part takes about a class hour. In the first part, students learn about climate zones by interpreting temperature and precipitation data. And in the second part, they figure out what climate zones their hypothetical grandma is visiting when she sends them postcards. And that, you know, her postcards just happen to include some descriptions of the weather she's experiencing. So this is developed to align with the NGSS, but one of the reasons that I'm quite fond of this activity is that it combines lots of different types of skills and disciplines. And so the activity combines science, math, language arts, and geography into one activity. And I guess for full disclosure, I just love multidisciplinary activities, and and I look for ways to add different disciplines into classroom practices. But having multidisciplinary elements can also make a lesson more usable in elementary classrooms, since teachers are often looking for materials that meet multiple needs. But so while learning science in this activity about climate zones, students also get to grow their strengths in math, particularly graph reading, language arts, and geography. And so that's one of the maybe more different things about it. But we're going to walk through the activity, which is an odd thing to do on a conference call, perhaps. But hopefully it is somewhat hands-on, even though you're just staring at your screens. So imagine yourself in the classroom, and we're going to do part one, which is exploring climate zones. So in this part, you know, eventually students are going to be looking at climate data, but before we start tossing climagraphs at them, we need to have a way to connect with what they might already know about regional climate variations. And I think probably all the people on this call have their own way of connecting with what students might already know. In this activity, there's a simple showing two photographs and that have kind of very different conditions represented, and the photos can be of different locations. These are just the two I chose, but the idea is to have the conditions look vastly different so that students can identify the differences here and ask them what sort of weather would they expect to find in these places. And, you know, if that's too vague, then adding in sort of questions that are more specific, like which place looks colder, which place looks drier, what type of clothing would you pack to go to each of these places? And depending on where students are located and what they already know about weather, their responses are probably going to differ. Like students in Maine might have a better idea of what cold and snowy conditions would feel like than students in Florida, for example, but that's okay. The big idea is that they get an initial understanding, you know, that different places have different types of typical weather. And so this is the way of getting them introduced to the idea that those usual patterns of weather are called climate. So regional climate, just to make sure we're all on the same page, but I know the people on this call are very savvy. So just tune me out if you would like to. Regional climate is the average weather in a place over many years, usually 30. It's described with temperature through the seasons, precipitation, and other factors like wind. It depends on many different factors like the amount of sunlight, which is dependent on latitude, height above sea level, shape of the land, distance from the ocean. And so we're not going to get into any of that with our third graders or elementary students in general here, but like all the factors of why, but instead we're just going to have them recognize what these regional climate variations are like. So students are going to, in this first part, explore 5 climate regions or zones with graphs that show how temperature and precipitation vary. And they're going to fill out an activity sheet called the What I Know About Climate Zones sheet, based on the information that they glean from graphs of temperature and precip data. And then they're going to have an emphasis on comparing each zone with others. So sort of a compare and contrast strategy so that they don't get too bogged down with details. But here's an example of one of these worksheets. Let's see, can I make this bigger? How do I make this bigger? Okay, it will not make bigger. So in any case, this is one of the worksheets over here on the right. And you can see here, if you're familiar with climagraphs, then this is the climograph data, but separated out so that the top part shows what the temperature is like through the months of the year, which are on the x-axis, and the bottom graph shows how much rain and snow falls, which is the same months of the year. So this is just a simplified version for elementary of something that you might be more familiar with looking like this graph, so that there are 2 y-axes, one for precip and one for temperature. And so this is more typical of a climograph, but a little complex if you're an elementary student. So the zones that students look at here, so in this example, here's the polar climate and the mild climate, we're calling them. They're all based on Köppen classifications, and we've simplified the names of these climate zones for the grade level, and I'll go into more of that later. But yeah, so the data here, students will see the graphs from these climate zones, and hopefully they'll notice that some locations will have colder winters, like the one on the left here, our polar climate, very cold winter and warmer summers. And some might notice that, in other areas, the temperature is more mild. Some places are relatively dry during most of the year, very little precipitation, and others are more moist. So here's the other zones that students look at. So dry climate. It was very difficult to make the y-axes the same on on these different climagraphs, but of course very important because the emphasis is on having students compare the different climate zones. So that y-axis for both temperature and precip needs to be the same. And based on elementary educator feedback, we decided to put both Fahrenheit and Celsius on the temperature scale, and both inches and centimeters on the rainfall scale. And so we can have a debate over metric units at the end of this presentation. But yeah, it was to appeal to more American elementary school, maybe teachers rather than students, but probably both. So here you can see this dry, the dry climate. So this is more of a desert, very little precipitation, and temperatures are pretty warm. And then that tropical climate, very high precipitation in comparison. So, so with the emphasis on comparisons, students are filling out this, this table for each of the climate zones, gets a row in the table. And students are asked, in terms of temperature, is it hotter or colder than other climates? So they need to write something in there, and the responses can vary. But something they notice about how it compares. Same with precipitation. Is there more or less precipitation than other climates? And then seasons. And seasons were one of those things that we kind of went back and forth on how they should be included here, but it would be good to have some prior understanding of seasons and just observations of seasonal change. That would be really helpful for this activity. And by third grade, most students have had that sort of observation unless they live in an area without seasonal changes. And so, you know, don't have an opportunity to see that firsthand. But we wanted to include that because it's such an important factor for climographs, that you have these trends over time, over seasons. And so understanding of that. And then the very practical question, what would I pack if I was going there? What would you bring? And so this section, I mean, the responses can really vary because students at this point don't have maybe the understanding that we do about what's in that environment besides the temperature and the rain and snow and the seasonal changes. So they may not know that, you know, in the tropical rainforest, I should bring my insect repellent and, you know, those sorts of things. But some students might be savvy enough to have that knowledge. And so, you know, the answers to what would I pack might vary, but hopefully students are bringing, you know, a warm coat to the colder places and, you know, shorts to the warmer places. And so that's that first step towards understanding. So then in the second part of the activity, this is where we add in more language arts skills and literacy type skills. And but students are going to use the information they learned about different climate zones from the graphs to figure out what climate zone their grandma is in, or a grandma. I suppose it's not their grandma. But in this part, so this is the second class hour, students are going to use that worksheet that they filled out before, the table with the different climate zones with the information as they filled it out. So it would be good to check and see where students' learning is at after that first class hour. And then they have 5 postcards from grandma, hypothetical grandma, and their task is to figure out what climate zone grandma is in. And they have a kind of a worksheet to fill out to say, you know, what's their evidence for where grandma is. So these are all downloadable from the website. Here are grandma's 5 postcards. She's quite the world traveler, and I'm sure she bought carbon offsets for all of this travel. But she has sent a postcard from these 5 places, and I think, you know, those of you on the call who are adults, which is probably everyone, I don't know, maybe not, but you probably recognize some of these climate zones just from the names of the place. So with students that are well traveled or a little older, or, you know, have some understanding of these places, you can just keep them with the picture side down until students have filled out their worksheet, and then it's their treat to figure out what's on the front of those postcards. And I heard from teachers it's good to tape these down if you don't want the students turning them over. But yeah, I guess curiosity and all that. But here's one of them. So grandma sent a postcard from Brazil. I wonder where that is. I have no idea. And so let's turn it over here. And she was there on March 10th, and she writes, "Dear kids, greetings from the rainforest. It stays very warm here all year long. Lush green plants grow and monkeys swing from trees. I am visiting during the rainiest time of the year, so I wear my raincoat everywhere I go. The monkeys don't have raincoats. They don't seem to mind the rain. Love, Grandma." So, you know, grandma sends very nice postcards, but embedded in her postcards is some information that could lead you to understand what climate zone she's in. So she did say that it stays very warm here all year long. So students have that information from the graphs, and then they've interpreted that in their tables. So they could either go back to the graphs, but probably they just need to go back to their table to see which climate zone stays warm all year long. And then she says that she's visiting during the rainiest time of the year, and she was there in March. So cleverly, she left off the year, so this is a timeless activity. And so then students could look at their precipitation information that they recorded in their table, or go back to the graphs, whichever you'd prefer. But so yeah, they go back to this, the information they filled out in this worksheet, and hopefully they can see that it stays warm here all year long is something that is common in a tropical climate, according to that graph. And then visiting during the rainiest time of year, and she's there in March, and here is that tropical climate rainfall. So you can see here that we're avoiding, explaining what average monthly precipitation is and things like that, but using more common language like the rainiest time of the year, and as the kind of entry into climate zones. So then students need to fill out, this is another activity sheet. They're gonna write down the postcard date. That'll help a teacher reference which postcard they were looking at, if you didn't let them see the front that says Brazil or something. So then they need to write down the evidence of what grandma wrote about the climate, and then what they think the climate zone is. And then after they've all made their claims about the climate zones, it's time to take a look at a map. So here is the climate zone map that we created for this activity. So this is, if you're familiar with the Köppen-Geiger climate classifications, this is a simpler version of that. And you can see here that there are just 5 climates listed, and those correspond to the climate data that students looked at. And the stars on this are the 5 locations that grandma visited. So, and a little behind the scenes, the climate graphs that students were looking at is the climate data from each one of those locations. So this map, as I mentioned, is a simplified version of the Köppen-Geiger climate classification map. And a map like this, well, it's far more interesting, I think. It's definitely off-putting if you're really new to climate science, or you're in 2nd grade or something like that. So what we did was take those, the main climates that are listed at the top there: equatorial, arid, warm, temperate, snow, and polar, although they go by other names in other systems. And we used only those for the student map. And the colors have been simplified too, to reflect more of a sort of a scale that goes from colder to warmer. And we've changed the names in the student version so that they don't use lingo that you'd either need to know, if you'd need to know about latitude for, or other sort of technical terms. So here are the those terms and what we used. So zone A is known as equatorial or tropical. We use tropical because equatorial, then you need to know about the equator, and this isn't an activity about that, but it's a good thing to learn about in elementary school too. For B, this is a dry climate, but it's known as arid in the Köppen system, and so we call it dry, just an easier term. C, warm temperate, is known as mild in this activity. The word warm is really subjective, and we thought that that was not going to translate very well. And the tropical might seem like the warmest climate, so we should, the students might get confused there. And the word temperate seemed to be confusing too. Continental, you need to know where a continent is. Or a snow climate, it makes it sound like there's no snow in any other climate, so we called that cool. And polar or alpine, we called that polar. And so So there is a bit of simplification that went on here, but the idea is to give that introduction and really focus on observation of the differences between these different climate zones as kind of a first step to learning about climate and then about climate change. And then looking at the time, it seems like I have enough time to tell you about more of our resources. So so this was the slide with that URL again. If you head to syed.ucar.edu /activity/climate postcards, you can get to this activity. I'll also tell you how to navigate to it from our website. So as I mentioned, we develop K-12 resources for teaching about climate, weather, and earth science. And we also do a lot of informal learning experiences in Boulder, Colorado at our NCAR Mesa Lab, including a lot of field trip programs for local students. We produce exhibits, museum exhibits. We're in the process of developing a traveling climate exhibit, which is very exciting. And when we are able to fund it, we teach teacher professional development courses, which right now there is a whole slew of middle school weather PD courses being offered. But one thing that we develop in all these resources are educational resources for the GLOBE program or related to the GLOBE program. And so one part of that is elementary GLOBE. And I would be remiss in only describing this one activity without telling you that there's others out there. And elementary GLOBE has a climate module that that we developed for K-4 learners, and that's a wide range, but we field tested it at those the ends of that spectrum and found that it was applicable to all of those. So an elementary GLOBE module is a fictional storybook that describes real science. In this case, the GLOBE kids, Simon, Anita, and Dennis, go on an adventure to learn about climate change. So this module gets into climate change, not just what is climate. And there are 3 activities that go along with the storybook. The first one, Weather Adds Up to Climate, is an activity where students learn how weather and climate are related. And the second, Seashores on the Move, looks at sea level rise. And the third, We're All Part of the Solution. Kids come up with their own solutions to climate change. And there are some really innovative ones from sitting in classrooms and observing students come up with solutions. I think they have better plans than almost anyone. But to navigate to our whole collection of activities, you can head to syed.ucar.edu. So this is our main website for the UCAR Center for Science Education. And you can see on the bottom here, there's a classroom activities link. And click on that, you'll find the full range of our classroom activities. Teaching boxes are resource collections that are sequenced and aligned with NGSS, whereas the other sections include individual activities that might be 1 to 4 class periods in length, so sort of smaller in scale. So if you click on the climate change activities, you'll get a list of our full K-12 classroom activities, and these are most of them are designed for formal education, although some of them, many of them are used in our informal learning programs that we have in Boulder as well. So, there's definitely applications outside of that. So thanks very much. I guess I'd love to hear from the group about whether you have ideas or questions or related resources. That would be wonderful.
Thanks, Lisa. Is there any questions that anyone has for Lisa?
I do. This is Jane Heinz Fry, and I'm from Massachusetts. And Lisa, this is fabulous because I just had the opportunity this past Friday to do professional development with a group of 3rd grade teachers.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah, And we were doing what you would consider the preliminary leading up to this activity that you just presented today. And so, of course, part of the question was, where should people go after they do what we did with them, which was more exploring weather and comparing data in Boston to the community in which they lived. And so they were starting to look at data about weather, but this kicks it to that climate level in a most beautiful way. And I have to say how much I appreciate how you collapsed real information to an appropriate level for the third grade students. And I have a question for you.
Yes.
And this also came up with the group of teachers I was working with. And I'm not actually at the elementary level. I was substituting in for this particular session. And the question that came up was about the use of line graphs versus box graphs. And there was a discussion about collecting raw data and then transforming it into line graphs. I noticed that you had both in some of your visuals. And also the question came up about centigrade and Fahrenheit and inches and centimeters. And I want to affirm the approach that you took was also where this group of teachers was going.
Oh, good. Because I was feeling kind of, sheepish about telling you, well, we've got inches on there. But we need to make it usable for these teachers. And so having both seemed to be the way to go.
That's what they said too.
Yeah.
Also with the thermometers that they chose, they preferred the ones that had both Fahrenheit and centigrade because, like it or not, you have to start with where the kids are at. And they are at Fahrenheit.
Yeah. And I heard from teachers that they, to get their students starting to think about weather, they were having them watch weather on the news or clips from weather.com or something like that. And they always use Fahrenheit. So, I mean, if, it needs to connect with what they're seeing so that, I guess weather's an area where you're working between science class skills and human life skills, and because of course weather is in both, and so using both scales is where we landed too. But let's talk about the line graphs and what you call box graphs and I call bar graphs, or some people call histograms.
Histograms. Yes, thank you.
So when there's the way I'd explain it if I'd been at the PD is that when there's a quantity that is additive. So in January, it looks like, what do you see there? A little over 10 inches. Look, I picked the inches. Or a little over 25 centimeters of rain on average, or precipitation on average, although this is the tropical climate. So I think we can say rain. And so here, because it's a cumulative total, using that bar is really helpful. It's not connected to the next bar. The next bar is another cumulative total. I'm not sure if I'd use that language with a bunch of third grade teachers, but it's sort of like your rain gauge fills up, that bar fills up. And so you don't draw a line between them. Whereas with temperature, even if it's inferred that this is the January average, boy, this is the most boring graph, but and this is the February average here, you can kind of infer that the temperature doesn't take some deep dive down to freezing in between those two. It's probably, you can kind of translate between them. So that's the way I would describe it. But it's definitely in middle school, kids are going to need to be able to interpret both types of graphs. So it's nice to be able to introduce them to that.
Thank you.
So I hope you have all their email addresses so you can send this activity out.
I do, and I intend to do that. Yep.
And
Right
actually, let's go back to
right
the
after this
elementary.
session. Yep.
So the Elementary Globe Climate module, if they're in the Boston area, the storybook starts out in Boston
Terrific.
during that incredible winter you guys had a couple winters ago where it snowed and wouldn't
Yeah.
stop snowing. So the question was raised, is this because of climate change? And so
Right.
that was the jumping off point. So if there's a local connection, I love to bring that up.
That's perfect. Thank you. What a gift.
Great. Any other questions?
Mine's not a question so much. This is Katie Boyd. Hi, Lisa. I just wanted to say that I really like this activity, and Clean has been, we're trying to find funding for, so it's not happening yet, but we've been trying to think about adding more elementary resources because we get asked from teachers, I think there's some standards, and I think there's just more interest in teaching this at a younger level, and there's just not as many resources. So I'm so glad you guys are working on this and trying to develop more, and just want to let you know that we're hoping we can add this into the collection at some point when we start adding more elementary resources. So I just thank you for developing
That's great to hear. I guess a few years ago when we were developing the Elementary Globe Climate module, I know that was sort of in discussion, but it got tabled or something to have, could we have elementary clean? And but at this point, there's more and more resources out there, and they're not all the same quality. So I think it needs a clean camp.
I think so
put some of
too.
these things through.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's what we're trying to work on. I think you're right. It got tabled for a while, and the discussion picked back up again a couple months ago. And then we're just sort of, like I said, trying to figure out how we fund such a thing, and get the time to do it and stuff. So hopefully we'll know more soon, and I'll keep you posted. But yeah, thank you guys for continuing to just make good elementary resources for these topics.
There's also, and I guess I'm curious, since we're talking elementary climate here, I'm curious what this group thinks about introducing climate change at the elementary level. That's climate change is not in the NGSS, and yet I hear students asking about it, or they know things about it. Elementary kids, they hear about these things, and it could be a source of concern, or they could feel motivated. And I think people on this call probably have some perspectives about, is it too scary to bring up, or is it something kids want to know about? Does it matter that it's not in the NGSS, or what do you guys think about that?
That is a really good question.
Mm-hmm. This is Kristen. I actually did my master's thesis on that topic, so I've thought about it a lot.
Wow. Okay, tell us all about it.
And it's been a while. I mean, it was in the early 2000s when climate change education was really becoming a thing too. But I mean, like you said, I've always really felt that the kids can't escape the news anymore, and so we have to be, as teachers, no matter what grade level, prepared to answer questions and make it less scary. And I mean, for us, our organization in general puts a very as hopeful a lens on this as possible, and that tends to be from a solutions focus. And introducing them to. There's one of my favorite little resources that I have found over the years is books and fiction. So there's some great elementary, and there's so much reading that happens. But like I Mean Bean, it's a series of books about two best friends, and one of them is called What's the Big Idea? Is about two girls and their elementary science fair they're going to do it on climate change because they get all freaked out about it, and then they come up with their own solution, which is creative and cute. And I don't think the other part too, that we have our organization has a couple elementary level curriculum. I mean, really not getting, I think, into climate change mechanisms, obviously, to like fourth grade because it's so complicated.
Yeah.
But just in the whole connecting students to their place and observations of changes in their place, and that whole piece, I think, has also been a real focus of ours too. I mean, the whole phenology, part,
Yes.
and connecting
Yeah.
students with the earth. And heroes. I mean, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind has an elementary level book that's gorgeous, and The Long Walk to Water. So anyways,
I'm curious because you did your master's in this. I mean, at elementary level, there's often a focus on social and emotional learning, and so tackling challenges and having grit and things like that are often a part of the curriculum. And it seems like an opportunity. Actually, I think a lot of adults could use that kind of training when it comes to climate change, is having how can we have grit and be persistent when when it comes to this.
And build empathy, and all those important skills of connecting. NAEE and National Wildlife Foundation, I should look quick, I'll look, developed actually guidelines for climate change education. I think those were many years ago. And I think they started at 3rd or 4th grade too. Actually, I think I'll look it up quick. But yeah, absolutely. All those social, emotional, like learning skills. And David Sobel, who is an old environmental ed guy, always talks about the ladder of environmental responsibility is one of his things. And I know that he has climate change kind of coming in at 6th grade when you're building off like the, we all have, like, when we're young, we're like, our world is like our classroom, and then how that builds out. And so focusing on solutions that are developmentally appropriate and within their space where they feel like they can create change.
Yeah.
I think is cool as well. But I love talking about that. I think it's really a great topic. And actually here in Minnesota, I'm on the Science Standards Committee, and we're just releasing our standards in the next month here. And we actually flipped the 8th grade performance expectation. Let's like clarify the evidence for the rise in global temperatures.
Yeah.
To 6th grade.
Yay!
And so that's middle school in a lot of places here, but that is elementary for also a number of schools, which could be, we've got some real work ahead of us, I'll say. But I think, if you count 6th grade as elementary school as well, I mean,
I think that's a great age for it. I mean, I know I'm oversimplifying things, but I talked to a bunch of middle school students who are just feeling the weight of all these problems, in addition to all their normal middle school life is rough problems, and so it seems like if we could stretch it out to the time when kids might still be idealistic and not seeing a dystopia in the world, that seems like a good idea. Yeah. Wow. That's great. I'm going to look that up. I have a lot to look up now.
The dystopian part too, it's interesting. I read a couple of things too that I have struggled with, the cli-fi dystopian novel thing, and like, oh God, my daughter's 14 and my son is 13, so I'm in the middle of this right now, and how they're so into these dark things. But it's actually, a few articles I've read have really argued for how it's actually important for them to read that, because they are feeling, you're so angsty and you feel all this pain when you're that age anyways, and a lot of those novels have these like really strong heroes, or a lot of them female heroes, and that they need to have things like that to look to as well. So I don't know, there's some argument for them actually being like, they're attracted to it because that's how they're feeling, like, and they're like, oh, other people feel that way too.
In one of the, not to give a shameless promotion for my book, but in one of the chapters of the book, I was looking at the difference between the way we saw the future during sort of mid-century space age, technology will solve everything, and now with this dystopic kind of, Hunger Games, like what's the world coming to kind of situation. And I think that, it uh, art will always express what we're feeling, and so we shouldn't censor it. It's what people are feeling, and we should pay attention to that. But it's interesting how it fluctuates over time.
Lisa, I'll add in experience, especially from California, which, I mean, we're all learning different connections. No problem being with the third and fourth grade, second grade even. We're often invited into such classrooms, right? So the teachers want us, the families want us, the principal wants us. It goes away happy. So definitely supportive of, that you're, that this is aimed more at the third grade. I mean, there's among the things of absolutely you don't, for younger kids, you don't go in and create nightmares, and there's no need to, right? We're working on people's whole life experience, and often what we can do is assure that their first experience with climate change is something that they're excited and they feel empowerment and they are eased into it. They have fun. I think there's a lot of times some of our climate education programs are just some of the best science education out there at all, right? There's often not good hands-on fun or, engaging ways like your cards that in science being taught at all in the schools. So if we have high quality material, people are going to love us, and then they go on. I think people probably alluded to this too, as well as from our point of view. There's, I guess the way I look at it is, kids are naturally scientifically oriented. The kids, when they're younger, are inquisitive. They're curious. They do things. And by the time they get to be teenagers and there's a social pressure, then science isn't cool, and I don't want to get there. You don't want to miss out on that period, that wonderful time when kids are more inclined to science and to learning and to feel they can do something about the world. And that will then help them when they're in the middle school and high school, getting things on a more deeper level, that they already feel this is a wonderful subject that they care about and they can do something about. I think there's lots of examples, and I think you folks in Boulder get this quite well. I mean, with programs at UCAR and the little shop of physics.
They're wonderful.
You're an incredible center for. We all should learn from you.
It's hard to do it on a national scale, though. We're still trying to figure that out, because that person-to-person contact is so important. And so I'm so glad there's people all over the country that do these things and bring resources out to schools and students, and both formal and informal education. It's wonderful.
And Lisa, actually, I'd have a question for you on that one. Is taking from Boulder and taking from UCAR and Little Shop of Physics and everything you're doing, your experience or how the programs are going, where in addition or supplementing or complementing the curriculum, when we're bringing things that the K-12 teachers themselves will then bring to the kids, you're a place where it is possible that the kids are either going to an event or you have specialists like Little Shop of Physics who go to the schools, people who this is something they really know how to do well and make exciting at a level that we can't expect the K-12 teachers to learn. I'm thinking the answer is yes, but that's something that's going on in Boulder too, right? The teachers can be doing the postcards and doing things, but they get the support. Often it jumpstarts the entire interest of the school and the principal and everybody. This is a great program.
I mean, I think that because we're in an area with a lot of interest in climate science, there are a lot of scientists in this region, and so there's already we're starting from a place of interest, definitely. While we don't have the bandwidth to go out to the schools, groups like Little Shop of Physics, and there's student outreach groups at CU Boulder, and there's other groups that go out to schools, and then there's student field trips that come to us. And we're formalizing our pre and post activities by formalizing, I mean we're being more rigorous about sending them out to teachers who come for programs and following up about, you know, whether that activity, you know, made sense after they got back to the classroom, because that sort of sense making, I mean, you know, field trips, there, you know, there's buzz of activity, it's exciting, but you know, some processing back in the classroom or before you leave the classroom, you know, sometimes that really makes a difference and integrates it into what students are learning. And so yeah, we've got a couple of our school and public programs people coming up with activities that that teachers can do when they get back into the classroom that fit with the activities we share with the country online, you know, through our website.
Great. Thank you.
Great.
This is Abby Rusky from Washington State, and I was just going to further sort of reinforce the idea that there's a lot happening in a lot of different places. And yes, it is absolutely appropriate to be doing this with elementary students. And yes, it can be very much reinforcing NGSS and teacher professional development in that. We've had, just this weekend, we had our local fifth grade group of students present to our Thurston County, which is where the state capital Olympia is located, at our climate convention, which was 300 people from across the community. And it was probably the highest attended session, and the students really, in a very amazing way, presented the issue, a solutions orientation, the way it cross-links with tribal ecological knowledge, and their project was food waste. So they linked that to drawdowns, food waste. And the same thing took place in the far reach of the state, where very conservative part of our state, where the students have done the same thing, and they're now partnering with the tribal casino and the local Safeway and other food producers and distributors to raise awareness around food waste in their community. And these students, also fifth graders, presented at the North American Association for Environmental Ed conference last October.
Oh, that's fabulous. Wow.
Really powerful work. And this that you've provided, Lisa, is just a great new resource that I'll share with our Climb Time network. And others should look to us in about 3 or 4 months, where the work that's been generated over the past year along the lines of teacher professional development and assessment tools and measures, as well as curriculum and curriculum templates, will be available from a broad-based network here in the state.
That's great, Abby. So what website would I go to find those in a few months?
Well, they're not completely up yet.
Okay.
The communication side of this has been taking a little bit longer than generating the prototype, if you will, that just got the funding last May, and these projects started up in June. But the result is what I've just described. The actual uploading of these projects is something it's underway in this last quarter of the first year of funding, and we're trying right now to get sustained funding from our legislature as we speak. So if anybody knows anybody in Washington, have them contact their legislative representative and put in a good word for this program. And we'll be sure to get the link to all the resources out as soon as it's available.
Fabulous.
Great.
One for on Washington, of course, you know, AAAS is going to be in Seattle this coming time around, and checking in with them. They can be supported. They have many ways of supporting education and using their resources. So they'll be interested in Washington in 2020. So,
well, that's great. Thank you.
Between now and 2020, I should say.
Great. Well, thanks everyone. I'm conscious of the time and know that folks have to go, but Lisa, thanks so much for your presentation and for the great discussion today. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Well, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Great.